Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the Blavatnik School of Government. So there's nothing like a lecture hall full of startled students looking up all of a sudden. Anyway, welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. My name is Martin Williams. I'm an associate professor of public management here. Today we're really honored to have with us the Africa Oxford Initiative for their first insaka of the year. AfOx is a great initiative that we at Blavatnik are happy to be partnering with on a number of events this year. So to introduce the initiative and the insaka and our speakers for today, I'd like to bring up Anne McKenna, who's program coordinator at the Africa Oxford Initiative.
Hello, everyone. Today is really not my day, so I won't take a lot of time. So the Africa Oxford Initiative, for those of you who haven't encountered us, is a platform for all things Africa in Oxford. We bring together academics and researchers engaging in different kinds of research that is related to the continent together, and there's a series of events that we'll be setting out in the next term, and one of them is the AfOx insaka. For those who would be more interested, insaka is a word from Bemba language in Zambia, proudly brought to us by our research associate Karen Mumba. The word means a gathering of people, communities, to discuss things that are pertinent to them. And for us, we are discussing things that are related to Africa research in Oxford. And so for our very first insaka this year, we are very privileged to be honored by the presence of two people who, in one way or the other, are very connected in that they both worked at UCT at one point. One is still there, one is not really there anymore. And so the point of this insaka is bringing people from very diverse backgrounds to discuss their interests in terms of Africa-focused research. And our first speaker today, Professor Kelly Chibale, is a phenomenal medicinal chemist who's worked in drug discovery and development, co-founder and director of H3D, and we'll be very interested to hear about how the whole process of getting a lead compound all the way to a drug that you inject based in an African setting. I'm really fascinated to hear more about that. The one thing you don't know about Kelly is that he's actually Kenyan on the inside. He will tell you a bit about that. And then Professor Sandra Fredman is a really good friend of AfOx. She's bringing together her entire team, which for Oxford standards is very well balanced. And we're delighted to hear, she's a professor of law at the Faculty of Law here. We're delighted to hear about their work in human rights, particularly the Oxford Human Rights Hub. So without much going on, let's please welcome our first speaker, Kelly Chibale.
Well, thank you, Anne, for that very kind introduction. Of course, it's so very nice that somebody has to leave Cape Town and somebody has to stay, because that's how things go. But also it's very special because I actually come from Zambia originally. So this insaka word is really most appropriate. In fact, when I was looking at it, I said, where does this come from? But now I understand the connection. So very honored to be here, and thank you, Anne and Kevin, for this opportunity to do this. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I will really, I'm a chemist, but don't worry about the chemistry because I'm not going to talk about chemistry. This is a very, very general talk. I've been in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town for the last 21 years. So the story I'm going to tell you is from experience. This is not a theory. It's something that I have lived and breathed. And so when I share this experience, it's because I have gone through it. These are the three things that I would like you to remember. So by the time I finish talking in 15, 20 minutes, these are the key points for me. And I think if I look at what AfOx is trying to achieve in terms of shifting the center of gravity for research into Africa, I think this is an example, if you like, of the lessons that I have learned over the last 21 years. And it's not because I'm from Cape Town. Everything I'm going to show you was built from scratch. It didn't exist before. So I think it's really important that you understand that. So I'm not coming here because I'm from Cape Town, not from Kenya. It's because we had to build something from scratch that didn't exist. And so the story I'm going to share with you is really an example of what is possible when you have certain things in place. So the first point I'd like you to remember is this, and this is my firm belief. We cannot just train doctoral students. Africa has been training people for decades and decades. Where are they? Where are they? And why are we still training people when we cannot actually solve the brain drain issue. So for me, and I'll show you an example of how we're contributing to this in a very small way. It's, yes, training, but it's also, we have to couple this training to creating career opportunities. This is really, really important message for me. The second point is we can talk about shifting the center of gravity for research in Africa. And we can talk about how Africa should attain scientific independence. You cannot do that without infrastructure. Infrastructure is the very foundation upon which you build. So everything we've done began with building the infrastructure first. You can't even think about competing for projects or competing to attract grants if you cannot show that you have infrastructure. So for me, this is a very, very important point. And I will show you why it's important that this needs to be really appreciated by the powers that be, that without infrastructure, forget it, forget it. But the third point I'd like you to remember is this. I think there's a tendency repeatedly, and I'm getting allergic to this constantly. We like to bemoan the lack of scientists in Africa. And we create things and say we justify what we do because we say there aren't enough scientists or there are no scientists in Africa. I think we should stop that. We should rather focus on how can we support those people already there, support them better to succeed, not to survive, because it's precisely the point. If we continue training people without finding a mechanism to retain that talent, then we'll keep throwing money into the drain. So I think we should stop bemoaning the lack of scientists. We need to focus on building on what has already been done in some places. So the so-called pockets of excellence. Build on that. Don't try to create something new and ignore or overlook what is already existing, that we can demonstrate something. And when we are successful, success leads to more success. So I think these are the 3 points I'd like you to remember. And I'll come back to some of the points as I go along. Okay, we can talk about all sorts of problems. But from where I'm coming from, when it comes to science in Africa, firstly, I think that the lack of infrastructure is one of the major problems. Certain types of things cannot just be done in certain places because of infrastructure. So these are some of the problems. Secondly, up to this point, we've not been able to create an absorptive capacity to attract or retain talent. So we'll go on training, as we've always done. Every African country after independence put in place a mechanism to train their people. Where are they? Where are they? Okay, I think that's a big challenge for all of us because we can continue training, but if we cannot retain that talent, I think we're wasting money and we're wasting time. The other point that I think is important, and I hope that I can share with you what we've been able to do, a little bit in a small way, is there is no entrepreneurship in science on the continent. I spent my time here in the UK and the US, and actually you will see how science can also be entrepreneurial. That we shouldn't just be looking to politicians and blame them for not creating jobs or whatever. And I will show you this story, that we can actually use science for development, that we can actually be entrepreneurial. And that is actually lacking. And we're always expecting someone else to solve our problems. And I think that it's really, really important that we support entrepreneurship in science. And I will share this example as well. We talk about networks the whole time. Networks and networks and networks. My experience of African networks is that they're very poorly developed. They are very poorly developed. We can debate the reasons as to why. I won't dwell on this. But whenever there are problems, problems are opportunities. Problems present opportunities. And so instead of complaining is what can we do to change the status quo? That's exactly what we've tried to do with our Discovery Center. So this is an example of a University of Cape Town Drug Discovery and Development Center we call H3D. And I think it's an example of a pocket of excellence. It's not the only pocket of excellence, but it's an example that has tried to address these problems that I've listed here in a practical and tangible way. And that's what I'm going to take you through very quickly to show you why. All right, I won't bore you with the details of this slide, but this is the vision. You've got to have a vision of whenever you do something. So our vision is to be a leading organization for integrated drug discovery. When I talk about integration, you will see a little bit later what this really means on the ground. So I won't bore you with the mission and the words that are here, but the point is really that this is all about partnerships. And you will see again, I will exemplify how a network of partnerships has allowed us to achieve something that would not have been even unimaginable just 5 years ago. But again, it's recognizing that it's not waiting until you have everything in place to start doing something, that you do what you can without wishing you had everything. And that's exactly how we started this journey. All right, so a bit of history very quickly. So H3D, as I mentioned, is a UCT Drug Discovery and Development Center. Started out in 2010. If you don't know why, 2010 is a very significant year. It's a year that we hosted the Soccer World Cup. That's why it's very significant. And also to remind you, England lost in the semi-final in the stadium in Cape Town in 2010 as well. Again, very important statistics. So 2010 is a very important year for us. So that's when the center was really accredited as a UCT center. And we really started the business of drug discovery in 2011. And I'll come back to the growth of the center in another slide. So when I talk about integration, although we are not physically in one building, we are basically in 3 places across the campus. So we have the Department of Chemistry. This is the chemistry, which is on upper campus of the University of Cape Town. We call it the head office because that's where my office is. Therefore, it's a head office. And then we have a biology group, which is sitting at the medical school in the IDM, which is the Institute of Infectious Disease and Molecular Medicine. And then we have a third component of the center, which is at the hospital. This is a Groots Care Hospital. This is where Christian Barnard performed the first world heart transplant. And we have pharmacology and drug metabolism suite group sitting at the hospital there. So we're basically in 3 places across the campus, but it's integrated in terms of having everybody working together on common projects. And of course, we like to brag that this is the first and only one of its kind on the continent. But it's not just that it's the first one of its kind on the continent. And I can tell you this, it's also very unusual globally in terms of having this kind of setup within an academic institution. Those of you who've been to Dundee, so the Dundee Drug Discovery Unit is very similar to the way we are set up in Cape Town. All right, I'll skip this very quickly. This is just showing that we really didn't have the experience or track record of doing this business. So when you think about Africa, you think about 2 extremes. The one extreme is clinical studies. In fact, the perception of Africa is a place where you can do clinical trials. The other extreme is basic science. So you have good universities doing good basic science. But what has lacked historically is translational research, bridging this gap between the lab and the clinic. And that's why H3D was set up. And because of a lack of experience or track record, we had to learn from the experts. So we are addressing our lack of experience and track record at 2 levels. One is to have a scientific advisory board of people who have done it before, so we can learn from them. And these are individuals listed here. The second thing that we did, in order to address our lack of experience, recognizing what it takes to discover a drug from the lab to the clinic, is to bring industry talent to Cape Town. This would not have been possible if we didn't start by building the infrastructure first. So we've been very fortunate to attract industry talent from Boston, from California, who are actually working in Cape Town, making a huge difference and helping to train the next generation of scientists. So we call these, by the way, we call them the Big 5. Yeah? So it's me, and the Big 5. So we think about Africa, and these are the Big 5. The first one is this guy. He's British, so he has to be a lion because he's British. This is an American. He has to be a buffalo, very dangerous animal. The next dangerous animal is a buffalo. Another American, very dangerous as well. So that's Joe. 2 Americans from Boston. And of course, you can guess who has to be an elephant. It has to be a German, surely. So Rudolph is the elephant. And who is the Bengal tiger? Has to be Indian. And of course, that's Sandeep. So very important that we really bring this experience and expertise to Africa, so then we can really begin to build an industry. Let me move very quickly and share with you what we've done. This is the picture of where we were a year before H3D was founded, 2009. This is when I started working with Medicines for Malaria Venture, based in Geneva, Switzerland. The only thing that happened in 2009 in my lab was chemistry. Okay? The rest of the components that were required to allow you to move a project from the lab to the clinic, we were outsourced. So the drug metabolism was outsourced, the biology, everything was outsourced. So this was 2009, okay? And there's the South African flag, it's a rainbow nation, and these are the Aussies and the Aussies, okay, and the Swiss. Fast forward to 2017. This is a picture, okay? This is a picture. You can see every flag has been replaced. Of course, I'll come back to why this flag is still here. But you can see we can do discovery from the lab straight into clinical studies. And we actually have a first-in-man unit, phase 1 facility, which in fact we've used to test the compound we discovered from the lab and do the early clinical development at UCT. Now back to why this flag is still here. It's a Swiss flag. The only reason why the Swiss flag is still here is because of their chocolates. Swiss chocolates are really delicious, so we need to have them still on the team. Very quickly, so these are capabilities. When I talk about integrated drug discovery, if you go to industry, I spent a sabbatical at Pfizer back in 2008 to just go and learn how drug discovery is done in industry. What do you need to set up to do drug discovery in a very integrated way? So these are capabilities. So we have the chemistry, including computer-aided drug design, which is what we call CAD. We have biology, and then we have pharmacology, including drug metabolism. And we've set up a whole suite of assays that you can find in a Pfizer, in a GlaxoSmithKline setup at the University of Cape Town to help us move programs from the lab towards the clinic. Okay, again, this is part of infrastructure. I've shown you, this is just how much we've grown. What I didn't speak about was the fact that I'm actually also an academic, so I'm not talking about my academic group. This is just purely H3D. We've grown from, I used to have 5 postdocs in 2011. We're now about 60 people in the center. Again, creating career and opportunities and jobs for our people. I will skip this slide. This is really just showing the areas that we work in. We work in malaria, TB, and antimicrobial resistance, which are current programs here. And I'm really wanting to focus on this program we call the GOOD program, which I'll finish off with some examples. All right, very quickly, it is simply showing you how the infrastructure and the expertise has been able to help us to attract partnerships. So this is just a malaria program that I'm showing you here. And you can see different partners from MMV to the Gates Foundation to the big pharmaceutical companies bringing projects to us that we're working together to move programs from discovery to the clinic. Again, on the back of infrastructure that we've created. So this is the malaria program that you see here, with many partners, including the pharmaceutical industry. The next slide is, very quickly, very similar thing. This is a TB program. And again, you will see a lot of pharmaceutical companies that we work with on this program here. Again, the important development was that we had to create the infrastructure first. And that infrastructure was a magnet for people wanting to prosecute projects in Cape Town. All right, I mentioned this. I'll skip this slide just in the interest of time. But I want to finish off with just 2 or 3 slides in the remaining few minutes. So one of the things that we have really thought about doing in the long term is about how do we keep this operation sustainable in the long term. And this is about really investing in the talent now. So this so-called growing our own timber is about really integrating H3D with all the industrial experience and expertise in the academic environment and really making sure that we can really invest in the next generation. And so we're not just operating as a small biotech or a small pharmaceutical company, but we're actually working to transfer the skills from the industry experienced people to the students who are working around us in the building and across the entire university. My second last slide is this one here. So on one level, we're working to discover new drugs. And what I don't really have time to discuss this, We have a compound now that's in phase 2 human trials that we discovered in 2010. That's now in phase 2 human trials in Ethiopia. So on one hand, we've managed to create the infrastructure and the expertise and the enabling platforms and technologies, which allow us to take a program from the lab and push it to the clinic. And that's been shown in a number of cases here. But what we also have done is that because we're embedded within the university environment, on one hand, we fulfill the academic mandate, which I have, which is to train PhD students and publish. But also at the same time, within the same environment, we create an innovation engine that is able to take the basic science knowledge and translate it into life-saving medicines. But the most important message from here is that we can create careers and jobs for our students in the same environment. Again, a very powerful magnet to attracting people to science because they can see career options down the line. That was my final slide, but I cannot resist showing this picture. This is really, really the final slide. So this is where I come from. And there's a particular message I want to give to you before I sit down. This is, of course, is the rugby field. This is the, if you don't know, in I was showing Anne a picture. The first inaugural University World Cup was held here at Oxford. Guess who won it? Guess who won it? You can tell me afterwards. They play here, okay? But there's a second reason why I'm showing you this slide, okay? I actually live here, right here. So this is Smarts Hall. I am a warden of this residence here. And you'll be very jealous when I tell you this now. And I work here. And it takes me 5 minutes to walk from Smarts Hall to my office. 7 minutes if there are too many students on campus, and I'm trying to be polite. So traffic jams, I don't know about traffic jams, but that's where I live. It's a beautiful place, and of course, this is Table Mountain. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you, Kevin and Anne, for inviting me again.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I think that's a pretty impressive feat to pack several decades worth of institution building into 7 years. I thought that developing drugs took longer than that, let alone developing entire drug discovery centers. We have a bit of time now for questions. I think let's take questions in groups, so we could take 3 at a time. If you can keep your questions brief so we can try and fit more people in, that would be very welcome. One in the back. Any others? 2, 3.
So that was an enormously impressive and obviously very successful startup. But you said that it was the only one that had done that. And I wondered if you could reflect upon the barriers and challenges that other people have faced and why it's not more common.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words.
Let's take the other 2 before we and you can answer them together. Okay. Yeah, in Fundo.
That was really impressive, but I was quite interested in just how male and how white sort of the board is and sort of the other members. So I wanted maybe Prof to speak a little bit more about how the project is really capacitating young black and colored sort of doctors and scientists in the community.
Great. And number 3.
Fundo really took my question.
Right. So question about barriers and challenges and question about further diversity.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the big challenges about this really is, from a university environment, is, to set something like this in the university in the midst of other competing priorities. There was a cultural issue in actually convincing the powers that be, to actually allow us the freedom and the flexibility to do this. But in many ways, I wouldn't really even say that the biggest challenge, I would say, was really talent. Because I was very fortunate to have not just my head of department, but also my dean and the senior leadership really buying into this vision at a very early stage. But the other reason why I think this was also had a massive support, not just from the University of Cape Town, but also Before I went on sabbatical to Pfizer, I was actually appointed to one of the research chairs. So South African government, one of the incredible things they've done, which is very similar to the Canadian system of so-called research chairs. So I was appointed to the research chair in drug discovery. So I know I'm making it sound easy, maybe not necessarily answering your question directly, but of course it hasn't been easy. It has brought, for example, people feel that we're swapping, taking all the resources, but I don't understand why they say that, because we have to raise resources, we have to fight for resources. In fact, 70% of our funding is international. It doesn't come from South Africa, so we go out and raise money elsewhere. Yeah, I think the normal challenges of addressing bureaucracy, especially one of the barriers that we had to overcome was to, because we lacked experience, to bring in the industry talent into the country was probably the most significant barrier. But fortunately, we got the university to agree to allow us to bring that talent. Yes, diversity, yeah, of course. So what you've seen here is a snapshot of an advisory board. So you haven't seen the whole picture. Yeah? So 60 people are not those. Those people are actually England. Yeah? So what you don't know is what's on the ground. Okay. But let me also say this, because this is something that will always come up and comes up a lot. Drug discovery and development is not something that's ever happened in Africa, including South Africa. So there's nothing historical to make reference to. So in other words, this is a new industry, something we're beginning to build from scratch. But because there's no history and track record, we have to find the talent wherever we can find it. So everything takes time, but even more so in an area where there is no history or track record. So when you say impacting communities, again, you have to see my academic group and see how many people of color in my group. I'm actually very proud of that. But in chemistry, when you say medicinal chemistry, they say it takes 10 years to make a medicinal chemist. Yeah? I'm talking about experience. Okay? We started just 6 years ago. And we've grown the thing from nothing to 60 people and the infrastructure that you see. And by the way, the thing about something like this is that it's not just the 60 people I'm talking about. It's also the indirect jobs that get created. 70% of the budget of the money that we've raised, more than $20 million, is from overseas. And we're spending it in South Africa. So I think I hear what you're saying, but again, what you see here is a small picture. The reality is very different. Yeah.
Do we have time for one or two more, or do you want to move?
Yeah, maybe.
If there are one or two more pressing ones,
I'm actually going to
Jody?
abuse my privilege and ask a question as I go take the other question. Okay. Is how much of this is trickling down to the rest of the continent? Like, this is the very first, but how long do you think will take before we have another one in Kenya, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and so forth?
Yeah, so I think the
Let's take the other ones and then...
Sorry.
Is this working? Great. So if you had to sort of list your top 3 factors that allowed this project to get off the ground, it would have been, say, the expertise of a few people that started it, sort of a permissive environment with support from the deans and so forth, and then external funding, or any funding really to make it happen. Would you say that there's been a drive to then expand this kind of work at other universities in South Africa, or alternatively for you to use your current resources to collaborate with other universities for the same kind of goals? Or are you kind of operating at the moment, as you say, like just on your own, essentially?
So there's one slide that I couldn't really show. I skipped it very quickly. So there was a second slide on our local partners. So we have local partners that we work with, but I am really a strong believer that the best way to build capacity is to prosecute a project. And I think it's more like building capacity while getting the job done. So I think one of the reasons why I think, in my opinion, why networks, and I mentioned this at the beginning, that most African networks are very poorly developed because they're not based on prosecuting a project. When I say prosecuting a project, it means that there should be a mechanism where people involved in the project, they can do what they're able to do in their environment. And I think that's the only way you can bring people together is when there's a project to prosecute. When we started this, the project was the driver. In other words, the project told us what we needed to have in place. And where we didn't have it, then of course we looked to partnerships. So we have local partners, but also, again, this is very, very important to me because when we talk about partnerships, it must be meaningful. It must be based on a common project. So what my experience has been is I honestly think that people are not yet ready for this because when we've tried to, I've had more disappointments, if I can be very blunt about this. I've had more disappointments from African partners than other partners. I don't know why, but I just have a sense that people are not ready. One of the things we get funded for by the government is to provide drug metabolism and other expertise to the community. And we go around the universities around the country, and actually people even accusing me of trying to poach their students. They wouldn't allow us to go there because they think, instead of saying, we're actually trying to offer your students careers. But what we're now doing, and I think is answering the other question about capacity building, is that we've now, this is my proposal I made to the Medical Research Council, that the best way to address all these imbalances, is actually, and I'll say this to any funder, is don't say, oh, so-and-so has got too much money, give someone else. And I think that's a mistake. What people should rather be doing is say, how do you link the ones that are more resourced to the ones that are less resourced? So the proposal now is, how do we work with the historically disadvantaged institutions, the historically black universities, so that we do projects together. And those projects also allow them to build capacity where in their institutions, but also benefit from the infrastructure. This is not tokenism. This is about a project where in some cases, like a new partnership we have with Walter Sisulu University, is that the idea itself is coming from the professor at Walter Sisulu University. And now they're tapping into the network that we've built up with our industry partners, that they can now benefit from that. So again, it's when people are ready, we try to market the platforms, but the uptake is very low. And I think it's people are just not ready yet. Yeah, they haven't got it yet.
Great. In 30 seconds, if you want to answer the other question.
I think it's related to that. How does it go to Kenya? Something we've been trying to do is we have a grant now. This will be announced very shortly. So the model, just the example I gave of Walter Sisulu, this is now South Africa, is that we have a grant with one of the companies. Maybe I won't mention this until the announcement is made. It's a 5-year grant where we also had a capacity building budget as part of that project, where we're going to work with my former students who are in Nairobi and a group in Ghana. But again, and then 2 other groups in Cameroon. But it's going to be based on this project where they are going to be participants in the project. And so our challenge is how do we help them meaningfully participate in the project? And again, it's building capacity while getting the job done. So we're doing it, but through projects.
Okay. Great. Please join me in thanking again Kelly Chibale. We'd now like to welcome up Dr. Sandy Fredman, who's going to be joined during her presentation by some of the students, or some of her students here as well.
Sorry.
Do you want to, I'll set it up for you if you want to start.
Yeah, I just have to close that one.
Yep.
And start the one behind.
Yep.
Yeah, that's it. Great. Well, hello, and thanks very much. We're very glad to be here. And since this is in true African spirit, we're doing this communally rather than individually. We are showing the work that we do in our project in all of the different dimensions of it. So we've called it Reconstruction and Recovery, Invigorating Human Rights for the World. And the picture that we've chosen is the heart of light, the fact that actually the human rights project in sub-Saharan Africa and in the countries that we're dealing with are very innovative. These are relatively new constitutions. They are developing human rights in highly challenging social contexts, and we think that the rest of the world has a lot to learn from this work. So the common theme is reinvigorating human rights, law and social change in sub-Saharan Africa. It should be sub-Saharan, really, sorry. The common theme is how we use human rights law for social change. So our first, I'll introduce all of us. Got lost. So first we have Njodi, who is talking about socioeconomic rights as an Afrocentric value, interpreting the Namibian constitution. Then we have Jason Brickhill, who's saying using courts to bring about social change, South African public interest law. He's talking about how you use law in courts. Then we have Helen, who's moving from human rights to remedies, again, not just looking at South Africa, but looking at New York State. We have Vicky, who's talking about the new Kenyan constitution, competing concepts of equality. And then we have Nomfundo, transformation through affirmative action, limits and possibilities. So I won't use up any more of anyone's time, but move on to Njodi.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Njodi, as introduced, and my research locates itself in the Namibian context, in a context where there is a constitution with rights provided, but social economic rights are not provided, or are rather inexpress. Social economic rights, such as the right to food, to water, to housing, and sanitation, are rather expressed as aspirational goals, policy directives, and so forth, something that you see in the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has passed. The question that I ponder is whether such social economic rights can be recognized and crucially enforced in courts of law. Now, how do I explore this question? Instead of importing an exogenous value framework, I look at endogenous value framework and look at Afrocentric approaches. What are the values that underlie human rights? What I assert is that there are shared and common values of African peoples that we can have recourse to in order to enthuse our understanding of human rights and arrive at the conclusion of whether or not socioeconomic rights are rights and whether they're enforceable. What I then look at is the value of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a common value. It has derivatives in the Guni languages of the Zulu people, but my assertion is that it is common amongst all African peoples. So in Kenya, for example, it's Umundu amongst the Kikuyu people. In Tanzania, it's Bumuntu. In Namibia, in some language groups, it's Untu. Now, what can this value teach us about human rights? I say that Ubuntu requires us to share responsibility and promote communitarianism. These are underlying features of rights of a social and economic nature. Then what does this mean for the state's obligation? I assert that the state has an obligation to provide such a right if we are to look at the Constitution not only as in terms of the text of it, but what is the general ethos. My idea is then to provide legal character to Ubuntu in order to allow us to interpret the Constitution in such a way that we recognize not only civil political rights in the traditional sense, but also social economic rights in the broader theme. So Ubuntu enthuses a sense of communalism, and in that very sense I pass on to Jason.
Thanks, Njodi. So my name's Jason Brickhill. I'm a Zimbabwean and a South African, and my doctoral research looks at public interest litigation or strategic litigation. This is something that goes by many different names in different parts of the world. Apart from public interest litigation, people talk about impact litigation, human rights lawyering, cause lawyering, movement lawyering, struggle lawyering. These are all related terms to talk about the same sort of work, which is using the law to pursue some form of broad social change or systemic change. It's using the law beyond the interests of immediate parties. So every case has plaintiffs or respondents, applicants and defendants. But it's going beyond that to try and achieve some broader objectives in society. Very often those objectives include trying to promote specific human rights under a written constitution, and many African constitutions, unlike constitutions in countries like the United States or the UK, include economic, social and cultural rights. So these are rights such as the rights that Njodi is looking at in his research, although he has to do a little bit more work in the Namibian context to bring them to life, because they're not entrenched as express rights in Namibia. But in many other parts of the world, South Africa, Kenya, and so on, there are express socio-economic rights. And civil society and other actors approach the courts to try to achieve broad change in relation to these rights. Courts are obviously only one way to do this. Rights are given life in parliaments, in our everyday interactions in civil society, in lobbying the executive to adopt certain policies. But courts can be one powerful way of achieving a real impact. And it's that my research focuses on, the impact, how we understand what results from strategic litigation. There are a number of famous examples in South Africa and other African countries. Most recently, the Kenyan election litigation is probably an example of strategic litigation. The most famous South African example is probably the Treatment Action Campaign case around antiretroviral drugs. But there's a lot more going on that's less widely known, less publicized, but that has broad-reaching impact, both for people's material conditions, but also for the political relations, the relations of power in society. And that's what I'm looking at. And Helen, I'm going to hand over to Helen, who is looking at remedies.
So a key question in using the law to achieve social change, and particularly the kind of systemic social change that Jason's has spoken about, is the question of how we make rights, and human rights in particular, real and a reality for people beyond the courtroom. So how do you make impact on the ground? And my research tends to look at this by considering the question of what kinds of remedies courts should give when the state has been found to have breached its human rights obligations. Remedies are very important because in some sense they concretize rights. They make rights real and make them have impact for people on the ground. Many courts around the world, including courts in South Africa and other African jurisdictions, are given broad and discretionary remedial powers to implement rights and to ensure that the government puts in place mechanisms that are needed to realize human rights. However, in giving courts these powers, puts courts in a real challenging position and a rather controversial one. And there's certain risks associated with giving courts these powers. On the one hand, there's a risk of judicial overreaching. And by this we mean that courts may engage in the kinds of decision-making that is seen as inappropriate, probably most likely because it engages in decision-making that is considered better suited to the democratically accountable branches of government, that is the legislature and executive. However, there's also another risk associated with giving courts these remedial powers, and this is often overlooked in discussions in this area, and that is the risk that rights remain under-realized. And that happens when courts are in fact too deferent towards the government and thereby fail to give adequate protection to rights on the ground. And this is as much a risk as the risk of judicial overreaching. So this tension really between these two risks is a huge challenge for the courts in adjudicating and enforcing human rights. And in many ways, the South African courts have been leading the way globally in navigating this challenge rather successfully, I try and argue in my research. And they've done this by crafting some very creative remedies which really try and recover a positive role for the court in holding government to account for its human rights obligations. And I look at a number of these innovative remedies in my research, but perhaps just to highlight one as an example, which is perhaps most widely known around the world, and that is the remedy of meaningful engagement. This was first used in a case called the Olivia Road case, which was where a group of residents in an inner city building in Johannesburg were asked to be evicted, or they were evicted, not asked. They were evicted by the Johannesburg city, and they went to court, and the court found that before these residents could be rendered homeless, in other words, evicted, the city had to engage with the residents meaningfully to try and find a practical solution that would uphold their right to housing. And so in meaningfully engaging, actually a very helpful agreement was reached between the parties in which the residents were provided with alternative accommodation rather than simply being evicted. So in ordering this remedy of meaningful engagement, the court didn't impose its own solution to a problem on the government, which would have been seen perhaps as judicial overreaching, but instead required the parties to engage in participatory, contextualized problem solving in order to ensure that the right to housing was enforced and upheld for the residents at the same time. So that's just a very good example. And that a remedy of meaningful engagement has actually gained a lot of traction in other jurisdictions around the world, such as India. Therefore, a very good example of how South Africa is leading the way globally in enforcing human rights. I'm going to hand over to Vicky now.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure you'd like to hear about Kenyan politics, but I'm going to limit it to equality in Kenya. So my research looks at competing and interrelated conceptions of equality in the 2010 Kenyan Constitution. So in 2010, Kenyans overwhelmingly voted in a new constitution, and the new constitution has a strong emphasis on redressing inequalities and has many equality provisions. But then, as much as the constitution has been termed as transformative, historic, revolutionary, the heart of my thesis is really about what is transforming, how transforming is the Constitution, and what are the challenges, because really at the heart of everything is implementation. You can have a very rosy and very beautiful Constitution, but then what about implementation? So how is the Constitution transformative by its equality guarantees? So it broadens the net of inclusion. For example, it adds, it has a very expansive and non-exhaustive list of grounds for non-discrimination, and includes grounds such as, for non-discrimination, such as pregnancy, health status, marital status, which were previously not there. It also aims to eradicate patterns of systemic disadvantage by including provisions like elimination of gender discrimination in land ownership, in passing on citizenship, because previously only men could pass on citizenship to their spouses, and it also includes equality, the notion of equality in consent to marriage and within marriage. And most importantly, it has the right to affirmative action. And particularly, there is this rule in the Constitution that not more than 2/3, there should be not more than 2/3 of members in any elective or appointive body of the same gender. And then the question comes, what about implementation? It's really very beautiful. So in terms of implementation, there have been many challenges, particularly in relation to first of all, the clash between various conceptions of equality, and hence the photo. So when we talk about the various conceptions of equality, there is the formal conception of equality, which insists on sameness in treatment, saying we should treat everyone the same, regardless of their status. And we would get like the second photo, because some people have, because of past injustices, they are not really able to access the same type of opportunities. And even if they access the same opportunities, the opportunities are tailored for example, the black man who has very much been advantaged in the past. So really, we need to do something more, yeah? And hence why there is the need for substantive equality, which recognizes that differential treatment is required sometimes in order to achieve real equality. So hence we would have, for example, if it's coming up with educational institutions, you'd have to have ramps for those who are physically disabled and in wheelchairs, so that they can be able to equally enjoy the right to education, the right to healthcare. So then what is the way forward? So one of the things that I really insist on in my thesis is a need to really meet people where they're at. The need to ask the question, what does equal concern and respect for different types of people, what does it mean? And in that sense, meet them where they're at, look at the context, look at what it would mean to say that this person has really been included in society. So not just saying equal treatment, sameness in terms of sameness in treatment, but saying what does this person require as a human being to show them equal concern and respect. Thank you. I move on to Nomfundo.
My name is Mfundo. My work is on sort of affirmative action in South Africa. As we all may know, South Africa comes from a history of over 350 years of colonial and apartheid dispossession that was pretty much achieved through political, social, and economic supremacy of white people, through land dispossession of black people, as well as through the use of the unfree labor of black people. So these are really the foundations of South Africa. And then in 1994, the democratic transition happened, and we had this beautiful constitution. A key aspect of it was Section 9.2, which essentially guaranteed the right to affirmative action. The provision provides that, it is legitimate to take positive steps to sort of advantage previously disadvantaged groups in our society. And there's this idea of using the Constitution, specifically this provision, to transform the lives of those who continue to be in a state of abject poverty. I mean, recently there were statistics that said that over 50% of the South African population that is predominantly black is still living in poverty. So this idea that the Constitution is supposed to be doing the work of uplifting this community. And this is happening in different ways. So we have admission policy in higher education, which requires specific measures to be taken to enable black people, women, as well as disabled people to have the possibility of getting admitted into higher education institutions. We have we have in the employment context measures that have to be taken by employers to make sure that their workforce is representative of the population, as well as we have, the very controversial model of black economic empowerment, which really seeks to encourage black industrialization and encourage black business to create more jobs, as well as to make black people in South Africa more economically independent. So my work really looks at whether or not these current legislative frameworks are really capable of achieving this transformative change. So in the Constitution, we have this idea of substantive equality, which Vicky spoke about earlier. And I want to sort of look at whether or not we can actually reach the state of substantive equality through the current legislative framework. Now, there's a lot of contestation that's currently happening as to whether or not the transformative constitutional model will actually take us to where we are. So some authors and sort of writers as well as academics are calling for, decolonization rather than transformative constitutionalism, because everyone's arguing that it's been 23 years and the Constitution hasn't really achieved its, beautiful outcomes that it spells out. So then I'm sort of thinking through what it means to talk about transformative constitutionalism versus decolonization. Can these concepts be merged to actually create something that will enable an interpreting of the current legislative measures to enable transformation for those who continue to be excluded from their own country? Thank you.
Sandy, are you going to speak again?
I just wanted to say that, I just wanted to say that this is a sample of 5 of my doctoral students who are all working on interrelated projects, and I think you can see that by focusing on these, as it were, very interesting new constitutions in very challenging circumstances, we can really shed light on the way in which we can reinvigorate human rights, not just for that part of the world, but for everywhere in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Those of you who are time conscious will have noticed that it's past 5:30 as we started about 10 minutes late. If you do have to go, feel free to go. Otherwise, I think we can stay for some questions. So we'll do it the same way as last time, take a round of 3 questions together. We've got one at the back there, one from Kelly.
Thanks very much for your talks. They were really interesting. So something that I was really interested in is the affirmative action in South Africa in particular, and just some of your thoughts on sort of the BEE and whether it is actually working. Is it reaching the right people? I don't know if you've got any results or anything, but really I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that.
Okay, great. That's the first question. Second question?
Actually, to you, Nomfundo, because you asked me, so I'm going to ask as well. I guess it's a question and a comment. So So when we look at transformation, we can look at this from different sectors, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know what your view is, because in some sectors, you could look at something and say, at this point in time, it's not transformed. But do you think that there should be a time frame for that? Because there are certain realities. Yeah. And the second one is a comment and versus question is, the easiest thing to do for anybody is to see that this is not transformed. There are more white people than, that's the easiest thing to do. But the next thing is why? We often don't ask the question why and understand why. There are always reasons.
Great. So let's start with these two questions for you, Namfundo.
A really good question. Specifically in relation to BE, I mean, the big thing is what we're seeing is that, there is the rising black elite, right? So the idea that black economic empowerment has actually benefited a very small proportion of our sort of societies of South Africa. So my sort of key question to that is, what is it about the legislative framework that is enabling that, and how can we change that? Or is there something wrong with the model itself? So I'm sort of investigating, is this an inevitable outcome of black economic empowerment, that only an elite class will benefit from it? Or are there ways that we can sort of reimagine in black economic empowerment that will enable it to reach to, the more disadvantaged people in our community? So that is a big problem to it. But I'm sort of trying to figure that. So I don't have an answer yet. But I'm trying to use sort of this model of substantive equality that says we need to achieve, redistribution, not just for the elite, but for like society as a whole. So that's sort of what I'm kind of thinking through, in particular in relation to black economic empowerment. Prof, really good questions. And, I think the one with the time, there's a big question going on right now is whether we should have sunset clauses to black economic empowerment, to affirmative action in admission policy, and then all that. But I think that, we can't do that. We can't do that because, as you pointed out earlier, we need that sort of capacity building and that building of community and transferring of skills. It's one of the things that the South African Police Service was grappling with in the beginning, of thinking through how do we retain the skills that we have while also ensuring that we sort of create a police force that is diverse, that is also representative of the people who are being policed. And there's huge tension there. And I think this tension can be managed only if sort of both historically disadvantaged groups and the historically advantaged group are on the same page. And on the same page is willing to really take time to build a society where everyone can, can really be equal. But at the moment, we have sort of like a claim to economic power by the historically advantaged that's sort of disabling that transfer, disabling that sort of change to even begin the process of saying we're going somewhere. So, that's a big one. And yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Other questions? One more question. Okay, Kevin.
Well, I want to ask a really unfair question to Vicky. Whether or not the new devolved constitutional arrangement that we have in Kenya will be an advantage or a disadvantage in dealing with the current constitutional crisis in Kenya.
Vicky, do you want to?
Oh my, talk about being opportunistic. Having a Kenyan here. So if I got your question right, you asked about will the new constitution be able to either be an advantage for the current political situation or a disadvantage. For me, I believe that the most important thing about the new constitution is the judiciary and the powers that it vests in the judiciary. It promotes, it helps the judiciary to be more activist, more, have a better role in terms of setting being the voice of the country in these difficult times in particular. And as we saw in the Supreme Court judgment on the nullification of the presidential election, we saw a very bold judiciary which was very much invested in applying the Constitution and its principles, rather than just saying, okay, this is a very difficult situation, and for the sake of peace, we'll just maybe let it just slide like that. But then, so the strength I feel is the constitution sets principles and national values such that even if there's a situation where there are things that happen that haven't been foreseen and that the Constitution hadn't prepared for, it still sets in place the various values and principles and mechanisms where such issues can be deliberated, and particularly by the court, and a solution can be found. Yes. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. And now I think we get to welcome down the person who asked that very cruel question, Professor Kevin Marsh from the Africa Oxford Initiative.
Thanks, Martin. Just 30 seconds, really. Firstly, to thank everybody for coming this evening, to thank Martin and Blavatnik for allowing us to be here, to thank all my colleagues in AfOx, to thank Kelly, Sandy, and the team. I have to admit that when we saw you were bringing 5 speakers and we'd insisted on 20 minutes, we were quite anxious, but it was fantastic. I mean, perfect. I mean, brilliant. And it's such a pleasure to have Kelly here as well. We've had a long connection. Kelly's very modest. He didn't really say that the drug that they've developed is a world-leading drug. They've done something which no other group has been able to do anywhere in the world, and it's actually going to be extremely important for the whole world of malaria. He was too modest to say that, so it was a particular pleasure to have Kelly here. So thanks, everybody. The whole point of these insakas is to try and have different disciplines brought together to give us an occasion to network. So I won't keep talking. There are drinks outside. I hope everybody will stay for them. Final word, our next insaka is in a month's time. Again, a very diverse presentations from Anna Nambreti and Simukai Chigudu. It will be at the Martin School, so don't come to the Blavatnik, it's at the Martin School. We're going to circulate these around different locations in Oxford which have a particular involvement with African research. So once again, thank you everybody for coming to this. Tell all your friends about it, come to the next one, and we look forward to seeing you there. And I hope many of you can stay for a drink and meet people you don't know outside. So thanks very much, everybody.